Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Diakopoulos, going to be moderating today's session. Just a quick little self-introduction. I'm an associate professor of communication studies and computer science at Northwestern University. I'm actually spending an entire year on sabbatical visiting the AI Media Democracy Lab in the University of Amsterdam. You know, I run a research lab at Northwestern, the Computational Journalism Lab, so we do a lot of work related to AI, automation, and news. And I've been running a blog project, which you may have come across, called Generative AI Newsroom. I'll put a link in the chat in case you want to check it out. But really, I'm just really excited to help moderate this discussion today on the topic of news media and generative AI. Probably the least hyped topic ever in journalism. So I'm glad we're here to talk about it, to cut through some of that hype, to get real about the possibilities, the capabilities, and also the limitations, and what this technology means for news media. So I'm joined by several esteemed panelists today. We have Aimee Rinehart from the Associated Press, Hannes Coles, a postdoc at University of Amsterdam, Mathias Felipe de Lima Santos, also postdoc at the University of Amsterdam, and then David Caswell of BBC fame. And what we're going to do is we're going to let each of the panelists give a sort of 5 to maybe 7-ish minute talk, just to introduce themselves and also to share some of their perspective and thoughts on this topic. And then we'll get into the discussion after that. And so I think we're just going to go in the order that's listed here on the schedule. So I will punt it over to Aimee to get us started.
Just trying to make this somewhat seamless. Hi, everybody. It's nice to be included in this panel. Let me do my very best to share the screen. How's that? Everybody got it? Okay, great. So I'm been bowled over by this topic. I've been working for almost 2 years on it, which is not a long time, but I got swept away like everybody else did in December. The project that I work on is Local News AI for the Associated Press, and we're looking at addressing the technology gap between national and local newsrooms. So a lot of my information comes from the local news angle. We read a lot about global and national newsrooms being able to seize this technology and really make it work for them, but it's the little guys that we're worried about. So to do that, to figure out what at least the U.S. local news landscape was, we surveyed and we got about 200 U.S. local news leaders to take our survey. And from that, we learned that local newsrooms could benefit the most from very simple automations. And I would say, I would add to that now, if we were doing it now, probably ChatGPT specifically. And they have a low capacity to take on risk. Risk might mean failure. Failure could mean they're out of business. There's a concern to add to an already wobbly tech stack. And some local newsrooms joke and say, what tech stack? You know, they've just got computers sitting on top of each other. But and the top concern is the cost, the training, and the maintenance. Some newsrooms are too busy to even take the time to get somebody trained on a technology that they may or may not be around for a while. So the wish list that we got from our survey breaks down this way, with transcription being at the top, social media content creation, all the way down to page layouts, comment moderation. The good news is there's a technology that exists for all of these wishes. The bad news is that a lot of local newsrooms, if it exceeds $100 a month, they often are not able to participate. So part of our project was then to work with other newsrooms to bring the technology to bear. So what we've done are 5 local newsrooms that we're working on currently. The ones with asterisks will use, we think, generative AI as part of its mission. So The first is Michigan Radio. It's an NPR affiliate at the University of Michigan. We will advance its existing tool called Search Minutes. The application currently takes online videos of public meetings in Michigan and transcribes them. We plan to add summarization along with keyword alerts so journalists will get pings for topics like pay increases. Our second project is for El Vocero in Puerto Rico. This will be a natural language generation, so not really generative AI. It'll take a small team, right now it takes a small team working under the pressure of an impending hurricane to translate multiple warnings and watches issued in English for a Spanish language audience. So we hope to automate that process, including the translation. Our third project, we will develop police blotter automation for the Forum Communications paper in Brainerd, the Brainerd Dispatch in Minnesota. AI would collect crime data and write up basic summaries. So our fourth project will be with WFMZ in TV in Allentown, Pennsylvania. This project involves creating a sorting mechanism for the hundreds of emails received daily on the assignment desk. AI will determine if there's a credible news event and add it to the coverage planner. And lastly, our fifth project involves working with Graham Media's KSAT in San Antonio. We will work on composing basic digital stories from video interviews and features selected by editors. The AI will summarize these videos and a content item is automatically added to their CMS. So we're hearing a lot from our local newsrooms members and customers, and also people who participated in our survey and online course. And so they're actually using generative AI right now. And some newsrooms have confessed that they're using even ChatGPT. So they're using it to generate summaries, create outlines, do a keyword list, create rapid construction of HTML, brainstorm for headlines, and adding hashtags. And this is one of my new favorites. And if there's another person out there like Hank Sims, then I would love to hear from you. And I think Nick probably would too. Lost Coast Outpost, which is edited and run, the chief technologist is a guy named Hank Sims. And what he has done is he is scraping local city and county meetings or meeting agendas. He's scraping those and then running it through ChatGPT or GPT-3 for the summarization of it. And here's an example of the summarization. Now he's done something interesting, and he's added a link to, you could read this as a sea shanty or Scooby-Doo or other variation that he has, just to make it fun. He wanted to have some fun with this, and that is what is possible. Also, when you run your own website, you can do that. The other thing that he uses, and he used this right out of the gate when DALL-E was released in July of last year, he started using it right away. And he uses DALL-E to generate images. And I asked him if he worried about putting local artists out of work. And he said he's never employed local artists. He can't afford to pay local artists. So this image cost him about 5 cents to create. His scraping agendas costs about $10 a month for him to run, just to give you a sense of the cost involved. And if some of you are wondering if generative AI is for you, OpenAI has an examples page, which I find really helpful. They have about 25, 26 things listed on that page. And I just went through the list and thought of all the different ways that newsrooms might be able to use this. You know, the too long didn't read it summary. It does really great with data that is not structured. So when AP pioneered its earnings reports automation in 2014, we used structured data from a spreadsheet to do if-then parameters. So if a stock price went up, then we said the stock price went up in the story. And we still use that to this day. You know, 9 years ago, that was really cutting edge. And now it seems sort of like the baby step that was taken in order to get us to this point of generative AI. So generative AI at AP, we're working across departments right now to figure out what the plan is, because anywhere where words and images touch down will be impacted by generative AI. So we think it's really important to work collaboratively and across departments to figure this out together. So we are continuing to use AI and automation to improve efficiency and effectiveness. It has to, adhere to our journalistic standards, but it also has to be meaningful for the people who we support, which are members and customers of the Associated Press. And, we also want to be clear that we don't think AI is a replacement for journalists. There's no substitute for eyewitness journalism or the human connection. So with that, I will turn it back to Nick.
All right, fantastic. Thanks so much, Aimee. Really, really fascinating use cases and so helpful to see how the Associated Press is approaching the technology, engagement in the community, thinking about use cases, and sort of, and also kind of being a little cautious in approaching this. I'd like to turn it over to Hannes now. Hannes, do you want to jump in?
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Great. Okay, so I have not prepared any slides. I'll just, you have to do it with me. So my name is Hannes Kools. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the AI Media and Democracy Lab at the University of Amsterdam, and also at the Digital Democracy Center at the University of Southern Denmark. And my research interests include computational journalism, generative AI, and newsroom innovation, which I approach mostly from a qualitative perspective. And I also like to work closely with newsrooms. And one of the biggest projects actually that I was involved in was the development of newsroom tooling at the Washington Post. But also currently I'm setting up a project with BBC News on transparency and explainability in recommender systems. Now, in my talk, I will be focusing a little bit on how news organizations, I think, should approach AI or generative AI in a responsible way. And I must say, in the past, I've seen that news organizations have had difficulties to keep up with, so to say, the frenetic pace of technological developments. So some news organizations have the feeling that these developments have even more accelerated over the last months, and I agree. Not in the least since the introduction of ChatGPT in November and other related large language models and AI tools like DALL-E and Stable Diffusion. Now, last month, I was involved in a gathering with around 20 editors-in-chiefs of local and national news outlets in the Netherlands to discuss actually the latest developments in AI. And I will use this gathering of these editors-in-chief in my talk. I will use 3 dominant discussion points on generative AI in the industry, and I will link these discussion points, so to say, to some key recommendations. So the first one that came up was, we are not ready for generative AI. And in the meantime, journalists are already using or experimenting with it without us knowing. So the first discussion point, in my opinion, also has to do with some sort of fear of journalists already using these tools, which might lead to negative repercussions. And for this example specifically, one editor-in-chief said that a journalist came up to him after, like, he told the editor-in-chief that he used actually ChatGPT in an article, but that article was already on the website. Now, actually, in my own research that I'm currently conducting in Belgium and the Netherlands on the different uses of generative AI, I've come a little bit to the same kind of conclusion that these tools are used secretly by journalists. And some of the examples that I think Aimee already gave resonate with that. So they're being used, for example, to rewrite press releases, to summarize text, but also sometimes there are experiments with personalizing formats and generating, for example, social media posts. So I think This brings me to my first recommendation, namely that the experimentation with the different uses of generative AI, I think it's good that there is some experimentation. So for example, one news organization has a working group, and I found that a good example, and they come together once in 2 weeks to discuss potential uses of AI and generative AI. And I believe that by experimenting, you will learn and experience the possibilities, but also the impossibilities of these tools. Now, the second one that came up was we should be transparent towards our audience versus we should not be transparent. So I think one of the editors said, if I recall well, in response to being transparent, that they are not telling their audience that they're using a tool like Google, for example. So why should they tell their audience about ChatGPT? And I guess, as many of you know in this room, there is quite a fundamental difference when using, for example, ChatGPT or large language models, because they generate and produce text. So the consensus also from that gathering was that there is some sort of need for guidelines that reflect a responsible use of AI and generative AI. And this brings me actually to the second key recommendation, namely the exact crafting of these guidelines. And the outcome of the gathering with the editors-in-chief led to a document that highlights some action points. And I believe that the document was published last week. Now, to give you an idea, they said that as an organization, it can be helpful to highlight some of the central values your organization has. So, for example, one of the big highlights of the guidelines is try to be as transparent as possible about how and explain why AI or generative AI was used. Another one that was included in the document was be curious and also, if needed, reflect and pause for a second on the potential uses of these tools. Maybe the conclusion of the discussions that you're having in your organization is that you come to the conclusion that generative AI does not benefit your organization or the use of generative AI at this point. And maybe that's also an equally valuable conclusion than when you would agree to use it without necessarily having these discussions or conversations. And then my third point has to do actually also with the fact that I do not believe that guidelines in itself are enough. It's not because these guidelines exist somewhere on a website that they will resonate with the members of the news organization or with your audience. So to make them more applicable, it can be useful to have, for example, different stakeholders coming together from different departments in your organization when discussing the use of AI or generative AI. I believe that we need to have these conversations like the one we're having now, actually, because these tools are out here, and I also believe that they're here to stay. Also, in relation to regulation, there is an enormous amount of regulation on its way, and yes, the European Union is a pioneer, but regulation takes time. So I think we should not wait for national or EU regulations, and I think we should come up in the meantime with guidelines ourselves. So to summarize, I would say experiment responsibly with AI, maybe also with generative AI, to learn about the possibilities and impossibilities of these tools. And also, I would say, dare to pause and reflect as an organization, if necessary, on why you would be using generative AI. That's it for me. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Hannes. And you know, the framing around the idea that journalists might be using these tools secretly, I mean, I think that's kind of tantalizing and also evokes a little bit of fear, like, are the editors going to block these tools? You know, there have been some efforts in different cases. ChatGPT is currently blocked in Italy. You know, that's certainly a response that we could imagine corporations taking as well. Okay, so I think we want to jump over to Mathias now.
Yeah, so hello everyone. Thank you for being here today. It's a pleasure to be in this panel with great names. I'm speaking right now from Barcelona, where I'm visiting the Barcelona Supercomputing Center for a month. So it's also, I see a lot of them here, so it's a pleasure to have them here in the audience. So I have been working the intersection between technology and journalism for a while. I work with the different newsrooms around the world, for example, La Nación Argentina in Amazonia, to develop some projects, once I was working with them between AI and journalism. But also I had the opportunity to visit other newsrooms around the world that were doing a lot of this work between data, technology, and AI. For example, ProPublica, I went there before the pandemic. I went to ABC in Australia, also SBS. And I want to share a bit of what I've been learning a lot about that. So before I start on what I want to discuss here, I want to share that I'm right now a postdoc at research at the Human AI project at the University of Amsterdam, like Hannes. And I'm researching the responsible use of AI in media. I'm going to share the link of our project in the chat as well for everyone who want to check. So talking about generative AI, we see that it's not only like a buzzword, but we see that people are really using that. One of the data that they have, like only from ChatGPT was launched like in November, and in January it was right like 100 million monthly user register. And just to make a comparison, TikTok took like 9 months to hit the same level. So we see that's something that came to stay. And if you're comparing the use of the visits monthly in March for the website, it has already overtaken Bing and DuckDuckGo, which means it's more used than some, like of these tools that we are used to use for doing some search. And this trend is going to also affect newsrooms around the world. And one of the things that we can see is, like, for example, the use for journalists and fact checkers. And that's where I'm going to discuss here 3 key points that I see potential, but also I'm going to present some risks that these tools could be used. So first, when we think about generative AI, has a lot of potential for helping, in this fact-checking ecosystem. And there is a recent study from researchers from the University of Zurich that they used the ChatGPT to identify if the statements were true or false. And then they realized that more than 72% they had success in identifying. And even after the data was trained, so really recent data. And the false statements were less accurate than the true ones, but still it was really high precision. But when we are looking to this data, they use data from a US organization, PolitiFact. And this is something that we also should think about. This was very successful using English statements, but would be also useful using other languages that are not that popular. And also language, because of course, ChatGPT is really strong when we see that it works for several languages, but not as good as for English. So how will it perform with other languages? So there is a lot of capabilities for using that to assist the fact checking, but would be interesting for this minority language if they will be excluded from the use of this tool, or the success rate will be not that good. And the other thing that I was also I think is very associated when you look for the use of, for example, ChatGPT, was also the use to not only the good side, but also the bad side, and the production of false news articles. We saw The Guardian that create these articles mentioning that, discovered that ChatGPT had generated false articles that were really reproducing The Guardian. And today we are discussing a lot about media literacy, but that will be enough for people to, recognize what is an article written by The Guardian and what is an article written by ChatGPT. So how we can manage to make people recognize what is the content that is really like a news article that is a true content or not. So maybe media literacy will be not enough in this world that we are coming with the generative AI becoming part. So that's one of the questions that I would also like pose for, we think. So will humans be also able to distinguish this human and machine-made content? So if not, how we can manage to create, things that they can really rely on the content? Or are we going to face another area of, disinformation with the level of going to increase way more? So the second topic that I want to touch here is about the use of generative AI for optimizing articles for online publishing. And then one of the things that I see a lot of potential is for like coding scripts, for data stories, and also headlines, meta descriptions, that I think what Aimee was saying, and mainly for search engine optimization. I think that's really a particular element that I see a lot of potential. Why? Because SEO is something that is very important in in the online environment, and the way that the content get distributed and then they get like the best rankings in Google or Bing, it's using SEO. And when you look for journalists, not all of them are aware of how to use SEO to write their content, and that's something that ChatGPT could help them to assist them to optimize their content after they write that. So not really written by the machine, but after a human write that, so they could like optimize for SEO. And that's also important to combat disinformation, because this will give a lot of visibility for this content that somehow is accurate and reliable information, instead of the other content that it's somehow mis or disinformation. But we also need to be aware that, these people that are producing this false or misleading content, they know how to use these tools. And they can also use these tools to produce, using SEO effectively, to putting their content in the top higher ranking the search results of these engines. So that's also, we need to be aware of how we can use this, but also be careful that these malicious actors can also use these tools to gain traction in these online environments and make a lot of money. That's what they do. And then the third one, that is about the generative AI for using for data stories. So we know that there is a lot of knowledge and requirement for people to know about coding. And this is not easy. Not all journalists can learn about that. And not all journalists have time to learn about that as well. And some of them end up relying, in this off-the-shelf solutions that they can build visualizations, or they can do data analysis, such as Tableau, Flourish, Data Wrapper. These are good tools, but they are also belong to someone else. So what end up is some of these visualizations, when they have some updates or they stop paying the subscription, they disappear in their website. So, and then you have the stories, and then you have like a huge area that is in blank because the embedded content is not working anymore. So that these tools can help them to somehow utilizing these coding skills, because they can create these scripts and then they can implement that in-house. We're going to be in-house solution, which is good, so they will not depend on just off-the-shelf tools. But also it comes to another point, that they start depending or somehow creating this dependence of these platforms, for example, OpenAI. And that's also moved from one dependence to another one. And would be that good in the end? So it's something that we need to be aware as well. So what I think is important is we need to acknowledge the benefits of generative AI, but also consider the limitations and the ethical implications, and trying to balance that with caution and see how we can contribute to, like, do not harm the integrity of journalism, but also contribute to stop the spread of this disinformation. So balance that. And one of the ways I think is really creating these ethical guidelines on how to use generative AI and show all the possibilities, like the best practices that, practitioners can use. So yeah, I want to highlight some of these aspects, because I think what we are facing now is somehow similar what we faced in the past when we had the advent of the internet, because there was a lot of skepticism about how it's going to work, what is going to change. And we see there is a lot of change that had been done in the last 20 years, 25 years. And I think it would be somehow similar. In summary, I wanted to address these points where I think it give you some idea of the potentials of these tools, but also some limitations. And I think, yeah, we need to not only think about this from, like as an optimist, but also be very careful on how to planning the use of these tools and having this proactive management and commitment to ethical and responsible use. So with that, I will turn back to you, Nick. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Mathias. And, I mean, so many useful points you brought up here. In particular, I thought the point you made about sort of how strategic actors will use these tools, I mean, also really has a potential, a really great potential to change how journalists need to work, right? I mean, these tools will shape journalistic attention in terms of how other actors in the ecosystem are using these tools, with implications on fact checking and even things like assessing freelance contributions or pitches. I think it's really has a potential to impact those attention dynamics. Okay, so I think we'll turn it over to David now.
Hello, yeah, and thank you for inviting me to the panel. I'm David Caswell. I have kind of two parallel careers related to news. So one is in product management. I'm a executive product manager at the BBC, and I've been involved in essentially news innovation for the 4.5 odd years I've been at the BBC. I spent a lot of time at Yahoo in a product director role around content analysis, but I also have this other career around on the academic side around computational journalism and structured journalism. So I kind of do papers every now and again, and I spend some time in fellowship and a few things like that. So what I'm going to do here for the time I've got is talk through kind of three things I think that are kind of on people's minds around generative AI at the moment, just from my discussions with newsrooms and people at the BBC and so on. One is kind of organizing what's going on, like just a way to think about it. And for me, I think a particularly useful one is the value chain for news and how this sort of impacts different parts of the value chain. And then there's a lot of questions around pace and around, how fast is this going to disrupt what we're doing? I think there's a couple of good arguments on either side of that. And then how do newsrooms specifically get started? Like what do they do now, or what can they do now to get moving? But the value chain perspective, I think, is important because it's a way to sort of organize all of the very different things that are going on. I mean, this, the news is saturated and our Twitter feeds are saturated and everybody's talking about this stuff, and it can get a bit confusing. And by value chain, I mean the big things that journalism does to deliver what it delivers, starting with news gathering, and then the production of the actual artifacts of news, the articles and the videos and the podcasts and whatnot, and then the distribution of that, and then on the audience side, the consumption of it, or the way that audiences consume it. And essentially in the pre-digital era and in the digital era to date, journalists or newsrooms have controlled that whole value chain, right? They do the news gathering, they make the articles and the videos and whatnot, they distribute it. I mean, the platforms kind of have taken over a big chunk of that, but news, it's on the website of the news page of the news organization, and then they control the consumption experience, because the article that they write on the web page that they create, or the product or the app or whatever it is, that's what the audience consumes. And if you start off maybe on the production side, it's pretty clear that these tools are going to radically democratize the production of media. So the example that Aimee had there of the guy at the Lost Coast outpost, that's a classic example. You have an individual who's motivated, who has a few $100s in subscription fees that they can or less that they can afford, can do amazing things, can do high quality, high production value, audio and video and scripts and articles and images and all the rest of it. And so that democratization, it's going to change how news is produced, not just in newsrooms, but one person newsrooms, or sort of technology first newsrooms, or remixing of news from different sources. All of these things, the potential to really change that is not just on the horizon; it's here now. So that's news production in the value chain. Distribution in the value chain, which has itself been impacted quite a bit over the last 20 years by social media and the internet and so on. That's got a new disruption coming, and you're starting to see this in things like Bing Chat or smaller companies. Perplexity AI is one, U.com is another, where essentially these are conversation experiences. You can go to Bing and do your search, and you get a little description with the knowledge that you're looking for. The links are there, but like, why would you ever click on the links? So you're starting to see kind of search move into this world where it's essentially, I ask for knowledge and I get the knowledge, not I ask for knowledge and then I get a list of links by which I can go in and find the knowledge myself. And that's a pretty radical change in distribution. I think there's other forms of that are coming along as well. Google have a all hands on deck project that they are in the middle of called Magi, M-A-G-I, which is basically about them reinventing their experience of search in response to all of this. Twitter have recently purchased a very large number of the little chips, the graphical processing units that are necessary to train large language models. Something's going on there. So the whole news distribution ecosystem, I think, is being impacted by this. On the consumption end, the audience consumption end, a little less in terms of products there, but a lot of interesting early prototypes, things like browser plugins or RSS readers that allow audiences to control how they consume the content. So the BBC might put out like an 800-word article, but the audience through a browser plugin might decide to consume that, as audio, as a summary, as a graphical story, as some other form. And these are already working in pretty simple prototypes. It's not hard to see products coming along for those. And even in the browsers, some of this audience control being built into browsers, you kind of just started to see that in the last few weeks in Microsoft's Edge browser, which they've integrated with their Bing Chat. So you can basically ask the chat about what the web page that you're on. So you can kind of load a PDF or load a web page, and then you can interact with that page in the way that you choose through the Bing Chat interface. So consumption, the control of consumption is starting to pass to the audience. And then news gathering, it's easy to look at all of these tools as sort of generation tools. I mean, it's in the name, generative AI, but these tools are also understanding tools. They have natural language understanding abilities that applies directly to news gathering. So they can do things like look at data and turn that into simple, into language. They can do things like, parse text in Twitter threads or very, very, very accurate transcription, and then the turning of those transcriptions into articles or scripts or whatnot. And so there's a lot of opportunity here that I think is just being realized, starting to be realized for using these tools in news gathering. And I think if you look all the way through that value chain, what the net effect is that these tools may dissolve the boundaries between each of those stages in the value chain. So, it might break off consumption control from publishers to consumers. It might change the distribution or parts of the distribution portion of the value chain from SEO to maybe some form of search that's very, very hard to develop traffic from for newsrooms. Production, obviously, lots of opportunity, but also entirely new forms of competition, the Lost Coast Outpost being a good example, and then news gathering, I think we've just started there. So I think that's that breaking apart or that sort of dissolving of the links or weakening of the links in the value chain, that's something I think strategically that newsrooms may need to focus on. And then in terms of the pace with which all this is kind of coming together, I think there's a set of arguments for things happening quickly. And these are basically around the friction or more particularly the lack of friction in adopting these. I think for media producers, there's very little friction. $20 subscription or a $50 subscription for some product, and a little bit of curiosity and attention to the tools, and media producers can produce radically different and new and improved kinds of content from these tools. So very few barriers to doing this. Anybody can swipe their credit card and start to use these amazing tools. On the consumer side, there's no barriers, right? I mean, if you can consume text and if you can consume video and if you can consume audio and so on, that's all you need. You don't have to learn a new paradigm. You don't have to install new tools or any of that kind of stuff. You can just consume this stuff without friction. I think in the product development, in the media product development end, again, very few barriers. You can swipe your credit card and get access to these APIs. Even the coding itself has become a lot simpler through the use of generative AI for coding assistance, things like Copilot and even GPT-4 and so on. So there's just few barriers to this, and I think that that's been evidenced by the rapid adoption of, for example, ChatGPT and GPT-4. I mean, I think we're probably past 200 million users now. I think that 100 million user number was a couple of months ago, 2-3 months ago. We're probably north of 250 or 200 or 250 million users. There's only 8 billion people on the planet, right? To have that chunk of people using these tools in that amount of time is pretty impressive. So that's the argument for fast. But things might slow down, right? There definitely is a hype cycle going on here. And the Gartner hype curve, after the whatever the peak is called, there's a trough of disillusionment. So that may be coming. There may be more friction coming, right? Regulation is coming, legal challenges are coming. Even the providers of these models, in some cases, are starting to kind of lobotomize their models, make them a little safer, but also maybe a little less useful. Novelty wears off. The OpenAI people, Sam Altman, for example, the CEO of OpenAI, talk a lot about how the novelty wears off of these things. You start using them, you get all excited for a month or so, and then it's like, maybe it's not quite as exciting as I thought. I think there's just a general tendency, people's habits change slowly, and that's on the production side as well as consumption side. And then it's hard to use some of these tools. I mean, prompt, using prompts seems like easy, and it is easy, right? I mean, it's a democratizing thing, but to use them for professional purposes is actually a little harder than it looks. So I think there's some of these reasons may argue for a slower approach as well, or kind of a slower rollout. And then finally, just how can newsrooms kind of get started? Well, one thing I would kind of echo what Hannes has talked about policies. I think in any size newsroom, journalists are already using this. I mean, they're busy people with deadlines. The tools are there. Why wouldn't you, right? I mean, I think getting a policy in place quickly is really important for newsrooms. Wired have a really good policy that I was very impressed by. It's very simple, right? It's basically, they did it fast. It was like, get the policy in, don't wait and talk about it to death. Just get a policy in place. Make it conservative to start with, because you don't want to have a big embarrassing event, but leave it open to adjustment and open to flexibility as you learn more. And I think those three characteristics, which the Wired policy is based on, are pretty good ones. The BBC have a set of principles on this that I'd suggest looking at. They're little weirdly named machine learning principles because they came along before the term generative AI was coined, but there are examples for a policy. In terms of actual use, I think it's very useful in figuring out early tasks for this stuff to think about these things as language models as distinct from knowledge models. So people kind of mix up the language aspect and the knowledge aspect of these things. And the knowledge side, thinking of them as a big database full of knowledge, yes, of course they have knowledge in there, but the knowledge side of it is where the hallucinations and the real challenges come from. The language side is much more stable and much more controllable. And so that means things like reversioning existing text using the language abilities, not the knowledge abilities, making summaries of articles and doing some copy editing and simplifying text and maybe even doing your tagging, turning articles into scripts, this kind of stuff. That's a lot safer and a lot more controllable than using it to generate, actual new content or from new knowledge, which is a little ironic because, some of the early live use cases, BuzzFeed, CNET, Reach in the UK, Men's Journal, these kind of things, they've actually used it for knowledge. They've used it for kind of simple, low risk forms of knowledge articles. But I think a safe, in my view, a safer approach is to use it for language only. And then in terms of prompts, I think as news organizations develop their own prompts and their own ways to use these, professionalizing the prompts, tracking them and testing them and evaluating them, that's got to be part of the process. And I think this is where maybe academics and other organizations that support journalists can really help. I think prompt engineering, in a way, it's less engineering and more librarianship. It's carefully testing things, see what works, doing the evaluation, and then keeping track of all that, so that there's a confidence in their use. Yeah, so that's what I'd say. It's exciting times. My view on this is that it's foundationally disruptive, and that this will be playing out in unexpected ways for quite a while.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, David. And just to pick on, I mean, you covered a lot of really